This is my first morning waking up after having some more severe symptoms yesterday. Started to get a mild fever in the late afternoon, and then that fever really spiked. On the advice of physicians, I've basically been told that right now testing is so limited still for someone like me who's young and fairly healthy. Even though I am showing symptoms that would suggest COVID-19, they told me I would probably get rejected if I tried to get tested. It's been a rough couple of days. The body aches and the chills are probably the worst, most uncomfortable symptoms. Mostly I've just been incredibly fatigued. Can't really do much except stream a lot of TV. Last night into today is the first time that I started to really sort of feel a little bit out of breath. But beyond respiratory issues, my doctor's main concern was dehydration. She recommended to drink a whole lot of electrolytes, so I have been on a big dose of Gatorade here. My husband Ben, who is back there doing a little cooking right now, is now starting to feel some mild symptoms, so won't be surprised if he is on my same path. So I didn't do a video diary yesterday because it was a day where I literally could not wake up. I slept most of the day, so I didn't wind up doing this. But right now, we are on our way to the hospital to get a chest x-ray, hopefully, because my breathing got a little bit worse overnight. So thankfully my chest x-ray came back normal, no signs of pneumonia or anything like that developing. It's kind of hard to describe. It's not like an illness I've ever really had. Last night fever spiked again and I started to develop some really severe nausea. So feeling like it's getting a little worse again, which I guess is sort of how this thing presents in some people. It sort of comes in waves like this. I've just been taking Tylenol, but that hasn't been really getting the fever down. Still have a fever, still feel like crap. But interestingly enough, I've developed a craving for tomato juice with lemon in it. So I've been drinking a lot of this. Last night I drank it out of a wine glass to feel fancy. So I woke up without a fever today for the first time in like almost 2 weeks, I think. Maybe, I don't want to speak too soon, but maybe starting to turn the corner a little bit. Hey, feeling better again today. No fever today. I had a slight one yesterday evening, but no fever today. And still coughing a lot, and my chest pain is still there, but definitely feeling like my brain is waking up again, and feel like I might be coming out of this thing.
Dasha is feeling better, and we are so happy to have her back on the show today. I am particularly thrilled to have you, Dasha. For our viewers who don't know, we share an office at 30 Rock that we affectionately call the She Shed, and neither of us has been there in a real long time. So thrilled to see you and glad you're feeling better.
I miss the She Shed so much, but I am grinning from ear to ear right now. Right? Just so happy to be back with you. And on the other side, just feeling miles away from where I was in those videos, which were frankly a little rough to watch back. And, you know, as journalists, we're used to sharing other people's stories. So it's a little strange to not be sharing my own, but that's where we're at. We are all part of this story. And unfortunately, I'm not the first or the last person to experience what you saw there.
So let me ask you, how are you feeling now? Because you look and sound like yourself again. Are you feeling 100%, or are you still feeling a little bit off?
I'm at about 90%. I'm still regaining a little bit of strength, but definitely just so much better than what you saw there.
It was amazing. In your video diaries, the day that you said you were starting to feel better, I could see it in your face immediately. It was just this dramatic return of life and kind of vibrancy in your face, even though you still weren't feeling well. Could you tell us more about your worst symptoms and sort of what that was all like? Did it get progressively worse every day? Did it roller coaster and you had some bad days mixed in with good? What was it like?
Yeah, one thing I really want to emphasize is I was a mild case. And part of the reason I started documenting this was to illustrate just what mild can mean in this context. I mean, mild for me personally was the sickest I've ever been. And I think the hardest part was just how prolonged it was. My last video there was on day 16. All told, it was about 18 or 19 days till I felt like I was on the other side. And the one cruelty of this disease that I experienced, and I know other people have as well, is there's a point where you start to feel a little bit better. And I thought I was maybe recovering. And then it just came back and hit me even harder with a second wave. And at that point, I mean, I tried to watch Tiger King and I couldn't even follow the plot of that. At that point, you just throw your hands up in the air and just try to push through. I was totally lost. That means you're
really not feeling well.
Exactly.
Look, you mentioned this was a mild case, and I think that might be really eye-opening for a lot of people who are watching thinking, wow, she looked like she really wasn't feeling well. To that end, what was it like? Because you weren't hospitalized and you didn't get a test. What was it like, trying to deal with doctors and get treated from home through all of this?
Right. So during the time that I was sick, New York City was so limited on their supply of tests. They were saving those for people that needed to be hospitalized, which thankfully I wasn't, but I was able to stay in touch with doctors. So as soon as my symptoms started to get more severe, my doctors did say, you're presumed positive, and continued to treat, assuming I had COVID-19. Telemedicine is an amazing thing. So I was regularly monitored by doctors via video, email, and telephone. The balance between sort of trying to treat from home, but also making sure that they were aware of how I was feeling just in case I did need to seek in-person medical care. They were really good about just figuring out that balance. And at one point, I did go get a chest X-ray just to be safe. So huge thanks to my doctors, Dr. Nandi and Dr. Kapoor. They were incredibly helpful during this time.
Oh, that's fantastic. You mentioned your husband also started showing some symptoms. What happened to him and how's he doing?
Yeah, I mean, this is the crazy part of this. Ben and I, my husband, we're the same age. We're the same level of health. We're both young, no underlying conditions. He had much milder symptoms than I did, thank goodness. He had a fever for a few days and was feeling under the weather for about a week, but he was nowhere near as incapacitated as I was, which is great because he is in charge of feeding us. So I think we would have had a really
he's a
hard
good
time
cook
if we were both at that level. He's great, and he is still on it, and we're going to make an extravagant meal this weekend to celebrate my first week of work.
I love it. Yeah, I have never experienced his cooking, but I've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence in the she shed, and I know he does a great job. So I'm glad he's feeling well enough to do that. Dasha, do you have any sense of what the recovery process will look like for you? Because I know the biggest thing is that, this has not been going on for that long. So people don't know exactly what it will take long term to get back to normal. Have doctors been able to tell you when you'll feel 100% like yourself?
Yeah, I mean, through this whole process, doctors have been incredibly frustrated with how little information they can give because of how little information they do have. And so through this whole thing, every bit of advice was caveated with, well, we just don't know, from what fever reducer to take to what vitamins and supplements might be helpful. I was on a steady dose of just Tylenol and electrolytes and taking some vitamin C just to try and boost my immune system. But the recovery process, one story that I'm following really closely is the antibody testing, which I'm hoping to get as soon as I can and can keep you guys posted on that. The antibody testing, which could be a huge component to getting some people back into civilization, really. And also plasma donations. I'm hoping that once I'm fully recovered, fully 100%, I can get that antibody testing and donate some plasma, which is maybe showing signs of helping some people that are still sick. Plasma from folks like myself who have recovered. But there are just still a lot of questions, and I'll be keeping a close eye on all of that, both for my own personal well-being and also to report on everything for you guys.
Yeah, I know there are so many questions and so much hope surrounding what we can do with plasma, those antibody tests. Dasha, we're really glad to have you back, and I know you were in great care. You and I go to some of the same doctors, and they are absolutely terrific. So I am glad you are back to good health, and we look forward to having you on regularly.
And when we're done with social distancing, you can come over and experience Ben's cooking.
Cannot wait. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thanks, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.